the Gerald R. Ford Energy Lecture Series sponsored by Varnum Law, along with the Ford Presidential Foundation. This series began at the museum in Grand Rapids last year, and we're delighted that Varnum has selected the library for another program tonight. In another new collaboration, tonight's reception is sponsored by the Ford School of Public Policy. We're glad that Bruce Goodman of Varnum Law, Joe Calvaruso of the Ford Foundation, and Susan Collins, Dean of the Ford School, are all with us tonight. We really appreciate the support, and would you all rise? Bruce and Joe, please come to the stage. Well, most of you know that the library and the museum are a part of the National Archives and Records Administration. It's very important for you also to know that support for programs like tonight's comes from the Ford Presidential Foundation and other partners. If you're not already a friend of Ford, we hope you'll consider joining tonight and talk to Joe and Donna Calvaruso, who are here, because that is the funding arm that makes these kinds of things possible. Tonight's program is being taped by Michigan Productions for later broadcast on Ann Arbor Cable, and we hear lots of comments from people who are not able to be with us for the program who see it later on cable. When we get to the Q&A tonight, we ask that you write your questions on the card provided and pass them to the two side aisles for collection by our staff. And you can submit those at any time during the program as a question occurs to you. And then I'll be sorting and passing them to our moderators. So the format for tonight is that Frank Zarb will speak initially from the podium, and then Frank and Bruce Goodman will move to the chairs for your questions and answers. Before we go forward, would you please make sure your cell phone is turned off and any other electronic devices you might have. And now to introduce our distinguished speaker, it's my pleasure to introduce Bruce Goodman, a partner at Varnum Law who heads their alternative energy group. Bruce?
Well, thank you, Elaine. We're excited to welcome all of you to the Gerald Ford Energy Lecture Series that our law firm got started last year in Grand Rapids. I'm one of the energy lawyers in our law firm, working primarily in alternative and renewable energy issues. Let me explain how the idea for this lecture series arose, because I think it's important as I introduce our speaker tonight. It was about 1.5 years ago that one of my colleagues, actually a client of mine, said, "You know, Bruce, Gerald Ford was really the first president that paid any attention to alternative energy, and a lot of the things that are currently taking place at the federal government level really had its genesis back in the Ford administration." And I looked into it and saw that, in fact, that was true, that Jerry Ford came to office at a very difficult time relative to energy prices and energy issues, and he actually got some things done. And I know from hearing Frank Zarb speak earlier that we're going to hear some of those things from Frank. So I took the idea to our management at the law firm, and I said, you know, I think we have the Ford Museum here in Grand Rapids. There's the Ford Library over in Ann Arbor. I think we ought to sponsor an energy lecture series, and thankfully our law firm decided, yes, that was a good idea, and I think this is our third in a series of unknown length, and this is the second time we have Frank coming to speak, and that's because he did such a good job back last September in Grand Rapids. Very enthusiastic reception to that talk, and I'm sure that he'll have an equally enthusiastic reception tonight. I think Elaine mentioned that we're going to have a rather short presentation from Frank, unless he's lengthened it from last September, but that's to leave a lot of time for questions and answers. And I know that you've all come with questions on your mind, and that's really the most important part of tonight, is to hear your questions and to get some answers from Frank. So we have cards. If you need more than one card, we'll pass those out. We'll collect them right after Frank finishes, and he and I are going to sit here, and we'll take questions until we're tired, I guess. Let me introduce Frank. Mr. Zarb played many roles in both public and private policy spheres, but most pertinent to us tonight, Mr. Zarb served as the Assistant to the President for Energy Affairs, or as I like to say it, the first energy czar that we had back when we were developing real energy policy. During this time, Mr. Zarb worked very closely with President Ford to develop and implement the nation's first national energy policy, as I say, during a time of great uncertainty in our nation's energy history. His counsel and insight provided crucial insight not only to President Ford, but Mr. Zarb has also been appointed to various assignments since that time in the Nixon, Reagan, Bush, and Clinton administrations. In addition to his public service, Mr. Zarb has served as director on 12 corporate boards, including chairman and CEO of NASDAQ stock market. He has also filled many public positions, such as chair of the Long Island Power Authority and board of directors of the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, which was responsible for distributing federal aid after September 11th. I encourage you to see the more extensive bio that's in your materials. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Zarb to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library.
Thank you. Thanks very much. That introduction sounds like a guy who can't keep a job. You know, I've always been concerned with after-dinner talks because people are home, they relax, they maybe have a couple of glasses of wine, and the last thing they want to do is to sit for some long-winded conversation. And I'll share with you a story, a Washington story that really was one of President Ford's favorite stories, although he always warned me, because he knew I used it a lot, he always wanted me to check and see if there are any congressmen in the audience. So are there any congressmen in the audience? It has to do with a fellow who was going to be hung for a crime. And he got out to the gallows, and the hangman said to him, "What are your last comments?" And the fellow said, "I don't have anything to say." And I said, "You know, we got C-SPAN here. You've got to have some final comments." And he said, "I have nothing to say." Just then a congressman got up in the audience, and he said, "Will the gentleman yield?" And the poor fellow said, "Sure, but hang me first." All right, for the next 20 minutes or so, and then I want to get to we can start some trouble here and have some good, lively Q&A. The next 20 minutes, I want to talk about this country's inability to develop a cohesive, thoughtful energy policy, despite the fact that we've urgently needed one for decades. But the overarching question I want to visit with you here this evening is consider energy policy in this form. Is it possible to reform our democracy so that it will be able to deliver long-term policies that benefit the national interest in the face of short-term political pain? The answer to that uncomfortable question is at the crux of all of our major national policy needs today. Using energy policy to frame the question is really a natural. How we use energy, where we get it, how we pay for it, all drive our economic and foreign policy. Energy shapes our global alliances. It impacts our national security. My own experiences with energy policy began almost 4 decades ago, and it may provide tonight a little bit of useful color. In 1973, the Arab members of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, OPEC, organized an embargo on the United States. As a direct result, almost immediately, our GDP dropped an estimated $15 billion, a big number back then. 500,000 workers immediately lost their jobs, also a big number in 1974. Hospitals ran out of fuel oil, and the federal government actually took control of our ability to buy gasoline and buy fuel oil. In 1973, we imported 35% of the oil we consume. Today, it's well over 50% of the oil we consume. Ladies and gentlemen, that's $400 billion a year leaving our country every single year and going to foreign sources, most of it to the Mideast. The impact of a major oil disruption today on our economy and our national security is unthinkable, but it can happen. So how can it be that since 1973, we have done so little to retard our exposure to oil imports from questionable parts of the world, and so little to regain some of the leverage we cede to those in the world who may not have our best interests at heart? Here's a little history. For a brief moment in 1974 and early 1975, a frightened nation seemed willing to look at major initiatives to drive down our dependence on foreign oil. The political landscape was very, very unique. President Ford was an unelected leader, still explaining why his pardon of Richard Nixon was in the best interest of the nation. The House of Representatives was dominated by a liberal freshman class swept into office on the fumes of Watergate. Long lines at service stations, hospitals running out of heating oil, factories shutting down. All of that sparked, at least for the moment, broad support to do something about our energy problem. When the embargo ended in 1974, the country was still confronting inflation, recession, unemployment, and some delicate labor issues. The nation was still reeling from Watergate. Nevertheless, President Ford made energy a very high priority, and he asked me to lead a policy team to structure a plan which would begin a long-term but steady process toward reducing imports from the Middle East. It took us 4 months in 1974 to create a comprehensive legislative package. During that time, the President met with us regularly, and he went through every detail as the plan was being built. He instructed other cabinet secretaries to be involved and to be supportive. Everyone got his message. It was this: this initiative is important to me and not subject to interdepartmental squabbling. Some in the White House, especially those on the political side of the West Wing, grumbled that it gave too much ammunition to our enemies in the Congress. The grumbling was quite amusing, and to me, I learned something. It was steady grumbling, but always just out of the earshot of the President. President Ford introduced his plan in January 1975 by way of the State of the Union message. He told the joint session of Congress that he would submit legislation which, if enacted, would force conservation through a broad range of measures, including the elimination of price controls, which is a holdover from the Nixon government, some selected taxes. He was going to expand nuclear power plants, considerable expansion over a 10 to 15-year period, boost coal production and build coal power plants fueled by coal, open the Outer Continental Shelf and other areas for domestic oil and gas exploration, support the construction of new refineries, develop renewable and synthetic fuels in a sensible and realistic manner, and create a strategic oil reserve for future emergencies. All tough stuff. And to add some balance, the plan called for fuel subsidies for low-income Americans who would get caught in the crossfire, also designed to be extra sensitive to nuclear safety and environmental standards. And it included a windfall tax on some oil companies who stood to get very rich if the plant went through. The Congress and special interest groups were caught by surprise. It was a wonderful, wonderful, but all too fleeting moment. Here was this man from Michigan, drafted to be president, facing his first presidential election in less than 2 years. This former congressman, whose political antenna was better than most, and he was proposing to increase energy costs for voters, expand controversial nuclear power, and extend domestic oil exploration to areas that had been previously protected. He was a politician who talked about doing what he believed to be right for the country, even if it was not in the best interests of his election campaign. When I told the president one day that our legislative proposals managed to irritate Republicans as well as Democrats, he smiled, as only he could do, and he said to me, "That means we have it just right." Eventually, the Congress woke up, and the opposition launched its attack. Initially, they didn't gain much momentum. The country was still bleeding from the embargo, so it was hard to argue that we shouldn't do something to guard against future disruptions. And the only real way to do that would be to significantly retard consumption through higher prices and greatly expand the production of domestic energy. For the most part, the early opposition was shallow. Jimmy Carter, who was getting ready to run for president, proposed a long-term energy policy to save gasoline by ordering service stations to close on Sunday. He complained that the president's proposals would be inflationary, and of course, higher fuel prices were part of the design of the Ford plan. Yes, gasoline would have gone from 53 cents a gallon to 70 cents a gallon, but the long-term benefits would have been very, very significant. The silliness was bipartisan. A senior Republican senator who, for the most part, was sober, urged that we should solve our entire problem with synthetic fuels. Never mind he had no idea what synthetic fuels were, their state of development, or whether they could compete in the marketplace. Democrats in the Congress came up with some alternative ideas which are also empty and were broadly panned by the media. So in those early days, it really looked like we had a real chance of gaining effective legislation. But then an increased flow of oil from the Mideast, a flat to lower oil prices, worked against us. A recession meant lower oil consumption, and OPEC, knowing clearly that its fortunes might be affected by our success, shrewdly influenced the debate by dropping hints that they were going to lower prices. As 1975 wore on, the Congress held hearings on the president's plan. The price of oil did not rise, there was ample supply, and most of all, there were the 1976 elections coming up. Those forces resulted in a steady erosion, which initially was a limited reservoir of congressional courage. As we began to lose traction, I went to see Scoop Jackson, who was a senator from the state of Washington and my Senate Oversight Chairman. I complained that what the Congress intended to do would be inadequate. And when I asked him what might push things back in our direction, he said, make another embargo. He turned out to be right. Without a crisis, Congress was not going to do what needed to be done. The battle continued for the rest of 1975. Strange alliances were formed. A number of trade unions sided with us. Consumer groups, led by Ralph Nader, opposed our intent to raise prices. But then we were surprised when he gained the backing of some important environmental groups. I asked an important environmental leader, how could you oppose a measure which would lower the use of fossil fuels? He replied, Nader helps us, we have to help him. That was one of the many ugly lessons I learned that year of how Washington really worked. The president never lost enthusiasm for his plan, and at one point he said, we have to keep fighting for every element, but in the end we're going to get much less than we want. He intended to go back to the Congress after the election and pound away for the rest of the package. I believe that had he been elected, he would have gotten the job done. In the end, the Congress gave us the easy stuff. They authorized the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. They gave us the ability to mandate fuel efficiency standards for automobiles. They approved appliance energy efficiency labeling, but they punted on price decontrol and all of the other important measures which would have angered their voters. And you know how the election turned out. Jimmy Carter talked the talk and created a government-owned synthetic fuels corporation to fund alternate sources of energy. It was scandal-ridden, did little to advance technology, wasted tens of millions of dollars, and was ultimately shut down by Ronald Reagan. But Reagan, Bush Sr., Clinton, and the second Bush did nothing significant to stop the steady expansion of oil imports. None of them made national energy a policy. Today, the current condition of our economy, the bad political climate, precludes any kind of initiative that will make sense. But following the election, there'll be an opportunity to take some positive steps. Advanced natural gas extraction technology and a proposed new pipeline between Texas and Canada can make a contribution to our energy base. Yes, both projects will require effective environmental standards, but a good faith bipartisan effort can make them a reality, and perhaps set the stage for something more comprehensive in 2013, which I assure you would not look anything like the 1975 plan. Today I can't help but wonder how the world would be different if the Ford energy legislation was adopted 36 years ago. Here are some thoughts. First, we'd have much greater control over our own energy universe. Second, energy prices would be lower to the benefit of our economy. Third, we'd be further along in developing competitive alternate sources of energy. Fourth, our foreign policy and defense strategy would not be distorted by our dependence on imported oil. I'm even willing to make the argument with you today, ladies and gentlemen, that we would probably have not gone to Iraq if we had achieved the higher level of self-sufficiency that the Ford plan called for. A few weeks ago, Iran fired rockets into the Straits of Hormuz. 1/5 of the world's oil supply travels through that strait. Right now, our only viable response is the U.S. Navy. Before I end tonight, I ask you to think about the economic turmoil of today in the context of that crisis almost 40 years ago. Ultimately, there's only one way to reset the massive debt strangling our economy. That is reduce spending significantly and raise revenues. It will not be accomplished with rhetoric. The continued failure to drive bipartisan legislation on urgent national needs can be summed up by an exchange I had with a very highly respected senator in 1976. When I asked for his vote, he said, "I really support the President's energy plan, but if I vote for it and there's no emergency, my opponent will use it against me in the next election." I never forgot that answer because it capsuled exactly what was going on. So here's the big question. How can we improve the system so that the most critical national issues can be addressed in the Congress without fear of political retribution? Two important words: leadership and trust. Bipartisan leadership in the White House and the Congress, and enough trust to cause both sides to place the needs of the nation above their own. It's entirely conceivable that party leaders could agree to carve out of very few issues that are simply too important to be subjected to the usual partisan ugliness. So let's talk about what I call the Carve Out Proposition. Our representatives on both sides can push these ultra-critical matters out of the political ambit and acknowledge up front that any bipartisan agreement will create shared political pain to both bases of both parties. Party discipline would be less about enforcing ideological orthodoxy and more about respecting the marching orders of party leaders to address a very few important issues without primary regard for their politics. Under this agreement, selected critical solutions could be pursued without subjecting them to the worst vagaries of the election process. Now, I know some of you are sitting here this evening and you're thinking that Carve Out Proposition is inconceivable. It's impossible. It should not be impossible. It cannot be impossible. And it may not be as difficult as it seems to move back in the right direction. A first good step would be to reject the skepticism that tells us it can't be done. And who knows, our elected representatives may even stumble on the epiphany that good policies are good politics, and pursuing a common ground is more secure than living in the self-serving fringes. Two big words, ladies and gentlemen: leadership and trust. If Gerald Ford was here tonight, he'd say, let's go for it. Thank you.
Well, if that doesn't stimulate some questions, I don't know what will. Good job.
Thank you.
If you have cards, hold them up, and we'll have people.
Pass them to someone else, please.
And any question you have, I've had them all, so.
Thank you. Well, let's start with an easy one. What do you think of the Keystone pipeline project?
Look, I think, it's a great example of what we just talked about. The president slowed it up. He knows it has to be built, and he's going to delay it until after the election because he doesn't want to irritate the part of his base that are concerned about the pipeline because they don't want the tar sands in Canada developed. It's an environmental issue. So he knows it has to happen. He knows it will happen, but he will delay it for political reasons. And that's part of what I've been talking about. That's the way Washington works. And on some important issues, it can't work that way if we're going to continue to grow as a nation.
I've had people ask me, why can't they refine that petroleum in Canada and ship it in some other way? And the explanation that I've received is it's really the refinery capacity, and the refineries are down on the Gulf Coast. Do you see a possibility of refining that petroleum in Canada and then just putting a lot of trucks on the road to distribute it?
Well, it becomes a cost of distribution question, and you'd have to run the calculations. But, the Canadians have a point. We're going to send you the oil. You want to refineries, build your own refineries. Or we'll build it and charge you a hell of a lot more. So the economics will dictate that we should do it the way we're doing it. Now, President Ford specifically wanted more refineries built in the United States. And the legislation we sent up provided two major pieces of legislation which would have expedited that.
Were there refineries ultimately built?
No.
Okay, so we're still operating old refineries.
Yeah. And it's the same political balance because nobody wants it in their backyard, and politicians will overcome that.
Two related questions basically that are asking, what about a policy to reduce energy use? We have the production side, and you talked about some of that. What about the demand side, reducing?
Well, that's a very important question and a very good question. And believe me, we looked at every conceivable way to drive down consumption. The Congress, in its wisdom, decided that, and actually it directed me to buy ration stamps. So their answer to this question was ration, which was inconceivable even then, because as we looked at the problem, the notion of rationing gasoline a la World War II, how would you distribute ration books? Well, the geniuses said you could do it for how many registered cars. So if you had 12 registered cars but nobody had to drive to work, you got all the ration stamps. Or registered drivers. I mean, you could have 6 kids in college that have driver's licenses, but none of them drive 50 miles one way to work. So It was inconceivable. We were directed by the Congress to order them, and typical government work, and I love this story. So once they received, I ordered them stored at the Treasury Department safes. And maybe 2 years later, an FBI agent came to see me, hush-hush secret stuff, and showed me one of our stamps. They had apprehended some criminal and found one of our ration stamps in his wallet, which didn't seem possible. So I called my guys in and I said, we better go and get an outside third party to come in and audit those stamps and see what's going on. They came back to me a little bit chagrined and said, we can't do it because when they were ordered, we forgot to number them. So that week we used up $200,000 of your money, thank you, and had them burned. So there's only one way that drives consumption in the United States of America that works, and nobody wants to hear it, but it's price. Had we started the price movement early enough, we've gotten a head start on taking control of our oil supply. We would have driven the private sector to invest more in alternative and domestic types of energy, 15, 20 years earlier. And by the Congress not allowing that to happen, they've put us in the position we are today. And I've got to say, every other president since President Ford saw the politics of it and declined. Now, so some side stories. Al Ullman was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, a Democrat. Good guy. And he said to me one day, I would like to introduce legislation to increase the taxes on gasoline and on natural gas. And I never knew why, but he said he needed help. I talked to the president. The president said, he knew politics better than any of us. He said, look, give Al all the help he wants, but don't politically endorse whatever he wants to do. So Ullman introduced a subcommittee a 37-cent a gallon tax increase, gasoline.
37 cents? Or
So I know he got to 37 cents. 37 cents.
Okay.
It was amended to 9 cents. It got to the floor, it was amended to a penny, and then it was defeated. So the politics of price increases are what they are. But if we're going to drive conservation, ladies and gentlemen, I guarantee you that's the way to do it.
Now, you mentioned during your talk the CAFE standards, at least the legislation that authorized mileage requirements for the automakers got started. It was one of the pieces of the Ford legislation that got adopted. Isn't that a way to reduce demand? And what was the thinking behind that? And was there applause on your side that, hey, at least we got that?
Well, look, it set a tone. Look, Michigan's a bad place to come and criticize the auto industry. So, but I've got to be completely fair here. I sat in the Oval Office with the heads of the 3 major companies. You get to calculate the years, you can calculate the names. I'm not going to mention them here tonight. And the president said, look, we have got to move on this, and we're going to have to get prices up, and you guys have to help me. Now, they were convinced, these 3 guys, good faith, that the American people were never going to demand what they didn't make. We direct what the American people are going to buy, because we make it, they buy it. I didn't say it in those words, but I walked out of the Oval Office with them, and they thought the president was from another planet in what he was suggesting that we do. So, left on its own discretion, there wasn't enough vision to say, look, the Japanese are going to come and eat our lunch because prices are going to go up, because they had to, one way or another, move in that direction. So that was one way to get their attention. We also concluded that we needed to put enough measures in the bill that would allow the American people to participate. The 55-mile-an-hour speed limit was put in place not only for that reason, but partly because it let the American people participate in the overall solution. And believe me, that was not without controversy.
I'm not sure. I look at some younger faces out here. I'm not sure that they're that everybody remembers 55 mile per hour speed limits.
And odd even license plates to buy gasoline?
How many people were in gas lines in the 70s?
No.
Okay, I guess there are fewer young people here than I thought.
55-mile speed limit was designed to reduce use of fuel, which it did. Incidentally, it also saved lives. But the governor of Montana, who was completely dead set against it, argued every step of the way, and he'd call me every second day to call me names. And then when it was done, he called me and he said, okay. He said, now that it's done, the legislature today here in Montana passed legislation, and if you get caught speeding in this state, it's $5 fine, and you're paid up for the next 12 months. You know, his point was right. You guys in the East take mass transit to where we're going. My people have to drive 150 miles to go to work every day. So, but it needed to be done. Every step was controversial and was a battle.
Okay, so we've talked about the auto companies. How about the oil companies? How influential were they on preventing the development of some of these policies?
They lost their credibility. It was unfortunate. First of all, they lost in the Mideast because they just lost their hold on the situation. Aramco, the American oil companies in Saudi Arabia, I don't know how many of you have ever been there, but it's kind of an isolated, walled unit where it used to be dominated by American companies. And one thing that struck me when I got there, the women could get in their cars and drive around the compound, but you couldn't do that anywhere else in Saudi Arabia. So you'd see women driving just to get the practice of driving. And then they'd ask you at dinner whether you'd like vodka or scotch. And of course you couldn't ship alcohol in and out of Saudi Arabia, but they had this enormous still. And it made the same stuff. They just colored one and called it scotch. But the oil companies lost their traction there because they didn't see it coming and negotiate better terms. And maybe they couldn't have. I can't judge them too harshly there. But they did some stupid things. We were working to get prices deregulated, which would push prices up, with the argument that the oil companies could take that income and put it back into U.S. development of energy. One of the major oil companies, and I won't mention it, all of a sudden announced it had all this excess cash and it was going out to make a huge acquisition of an electric motor company that had nothing to do with energy, nothing to do with a company that made electric motors, that sold it to refrigerators. And here we were fighting to get that done, and they spring at us in the middle of the night. And then this never got to be too public, but I get a call from the chairman of Exxon, who was then the interim chairman. And, he was my mole. He was an advisor. I couldn't admit that because to have an advisor from the oil industry would have been sacrilege. And he said to me, have you been looking at runs to stills? I said, I get my monthly report, looked all right to me. Runs to stills is a report that shows what the industry is doing. And when they take a barrel of oil, how much of it goes to gasoline, how much of it goes to fuel oil. And he said, well, take another look and call me back tomorrow. And I did that, and he said, as you can see, the gasoline production is decreasing. Now here we are ready to go into a summer. President's out there on the limb arguing to get prices deregulated so we can invest more in domestic oil. And these oil companies were beginning to intentionally shorten on the supply of gasoline so prices would spike in the summer. Well, needless to say, I was a little bit angry. In those days, we didn't have emails, so I sent a telegram to these guys at home. And I said to them, effectively, we've noticed this, and it will not happen. And you could see, when you looked at the charts, within the next 7 to 10 days, gasoline production went like this. And it made me, these were supposed to be the guys that were good guys trying to solve the problem. So it gave me a good education. And I didn't make it a big deal, except that the Senate investigators ultimately picked it up, and they were in our records all the time, and gave Jerry Ford good marks for finding it, stopping it in its tracks, and just just skewered the oil companies for what they did, but they brought it on themselves. So I think they've gotten one hell of a lot better in the last 20 years and a lot more mature and a lot more civilized. But I got to tell you, they didn't help.
You mentioned that part of the energy package that President Ford proposed was to encourage nuclear energy. What was the result of that effort, and what is your position, if you want to take one, on nuclear energy as a partial solution currently?
Well, listen, you got to put it back into the context of 1975, which is, the answers could be a little different today, but it was clearly the right technology. The economics were right. You made the investment, you got paid back. The private sector would do it. There was sufficient insurance protection by the government that protected you. Technology had gotten very good. We had the Atomic Energy Commission in those days, that's changed, that had stringent regulations. And the French were on the path of having 80% of all their electric power on nuclear power, and that's where they are today. So it made a lot of sense to do it. And what we said in the legislation, that if you designed a plant, and we approved it, we the government, and you wanted to build another plant exactly like that one, we would expedite your licensing. We also had legislation which said if you want to build a nuclear power plant and you cite it, there'd be legislation which would limit the litigation time that people could do just to be nuisances, because one of the favorite tricks is to litigate till it's no longer economic to do. That put a stop to that. But the anti-nuclear attitude was almost a religion on the parts of some. And it was hard to argue because they paint this horror picture of the Japanese and what they went through. My judgment of nuclear, for whatever it's worth, is that it's about...
You're talking now of the Japanese on the atomic bomb having been dropped, or you're talking about the tidal wave?
Tsunami.
Okay.
And there was 3 Mile Island, you remember that?
Yep.
So, like all technologies, you have these incidents, but they scare people. But the Congress used it as a political weapon. They used the fear of this as a political weapon. It had nothing to do with energy. It had nothing to do with what they thought was right. It had to do with them being champions of those who were anti-nuclear. And they were able to make it. My wife, who's a school teacher, designed a coloring book for young children. And it was energy, to explain what energy was, how you conserve it, what gasoline is. And there was one page on nuclear, and this is an atom, the color it yellow. I took more grief, she didn't get paid for this. I took more grief from that from a congressional committee. I testified 193 times in 2.5 years. And one of those times were these characters who wanted to take my head off because my wife had this harmless little coloring book. But those were the times. And it prevented sensible, good public policy in a needed area. We could have argued it could have been reshaped, but they just stopped it.
The Nixon and Ford administration had Project Independence, and it included a plan to increase coal production and consumption on the electric generation side. How did Presidents Ford and Ford's environmental stance, how is he going to protect the nation if, in fact, coal did ramp up?
Good question. Good question. Nixon was Project Independence, always unrealistic. We didn't need to be independent. All we needed to do was reduce the amount we take from bad parts of the world, and taking it from Canada is just fine. But Ford did have coal as one of his components, but also drove the scrubber technology simultaneously. So had we not stopped coal advances, scrubber technology would have made leaps and bounds, and today we could burn coal that would be safe. But we're years and years away from that now, simply because we stopped the economic momentum to get it done.
I read a piece recently that suggested that the U.S. engage with China to develop cleaner coal technology, since we're never going to build another coal plant, the author said, in the U.S., we ought to go over to China and help them build the cleanest plants possible. I think that makes your point, is if you're not developing this technology, it's not improving.
Yeah, and you know, the notion of, it's noble to go clean up the Chinese air. We have some issues here that need attention. And incidentally, the reason we're going to continue to see spikes in gasoline going forward and not coming down very much is because of the Chinese, who are growing so fast, and they're in the market consuming a heck of a lot of fossil fuel, as are the Indians. So that dynamic has changed forever.
Do they get a greater proportion of their oil from the Mideast than we do? Do you know?
I don't know the answer to that.
I tend to think that's true, but
I don't know where else it would come from, frankly.
Yeah. Okay. Getting a little more political, perhaps, is the Simpson-Bowles Commission an example of what would happen if your carve-out idea were to be pursued?
Yeah, maybe.
That's the
Yeah, maybe.
that's the commission that tried to figure out what we're going to do with revenues
what I had in
and
mind
entitlements.
is a president in the White House who had the courage and the integrity, and he stood up before the American people and he said, look, there are 2 or 3 issues in this country we just can't do this with anymore. And I'm asking the leaders of the Congress to share with me. We'll take energy policy or economic policy. Let's take the debt. And we know that we're going to have to cut entitlements, which is going to hurt the Democratic base. And we know we're going to have to increase revenues, which is going to hurt the... Now, I, as president, will advocate that we do both. The leaders will support me. And any of our members who use it in the next election will be the first ones to come down on. Now, as practical human beings, you and I would come to that kind of an agreement. I don't see any reason why they can't. I think in the election coming up, if the Republican nominee got out publicly and talked about this, I'm going to advocate that we do the 1 or 2 things together. And I'm going to trust the other side, and they're going to have to trust me. I think people would cheer them in the streets. I think everybody's just fed up with where we are. Now, there are those, especially old hands from the Ford government, who kind of roll their eyes and think I belong on another planet. But I really believe it can be done with a Jerry Ford in the White House. I'm convinced it could be done. Look, I sat in the Oval Office with him and the Speaker of the House and the Senate Majority Leader, Carl Albert and Mike Mansfield, and we cut a deal, shook hands, and the world never even knew that meeting took place. And that was because the president had a trust level that they could work with him. And that's what we need back in politics.
Do you think it takes somebody who really is steeped in congressional politics to be able to do that? I mean,
No.
I think in my lifetime of Jerry Ford and of Lyndon Johnson, both of whom understood from whence they came and were able to deal with some of those politics.
Yeah, but he had an element of character that doesn't come from other politicians. And I was telling a story earlier in the waiting room. We were working 20 hours a day. There was a meeting in the cabinet room, after which the president said, I'd like to see you. I thought, well, he's going to ask me to help save the free world. He looked at me, he took me over, sat me down, and he said, you look like, and the word starts with an S. I was kind of... And true, I've been working, and he said, this is Thursday. Friday, you're taking your family to Camp David, and you're going to be there for the weekend. And every 5 or 6 weeks, you're going to Camp David for a minimum of 3 days, and I'm going to get a report. Now, you tell me another president of the United States who was willing to share Camp David with one of his people because he cared about him. That goes a lot deeper than a career politician.
Agreed. In your opinion, what nation has a good energy policy, or what nation is doing it the right way, or at least better than us?
Well,
maybe that last one's too easy a question.
well, most of the French because Europe has no choice. They have to do it. The Japanese have no choice. They have no energy of their own, so they're forced to do the best they can. Unfortunately, they also were culprits when we tried to form a consortium of consumers. The Japanese went into the spot market and bid up prices to take it away from the rest of the consumers. So although we had good intentions, there were cheats among us. But the Europeans do energy pretty well.
And is it that they have a tax on their oil? I mean, we always hear of how expensive their oil is. They're in the same marketplace.
Yeah, they tax their oil, but they also build these nuclear power plants so that majority of their electric power comes from nuclear power. And they did it in a way that make the economics work out. So they did what they had to do because they had to do it. They didn't have the choices we had.
I was at a lecture last week where the speaker indicated that the taxes on our gasoline that currently exist don't cover the infrastructure expense of just maintaining the roads and bridges. In my mind, as he was speaking, I thought to myself, well, how hard is that to make the argument that we need higher taxes on transportation fuels just to maintain our roads?
I don't know where it was. It used to be that the taxes funded the infrastructure trust fund, but that may no longer be the case. I'll tell you something about infrastructure too, just to kind of keep you awake. Before I was drafted to be a so-called energy czar, which was invented by Doonesbury, and it wasn't complimentary. I was in the Office of Management and Budget, and that's how I first got to know the then Vice President. And the country was going through an inflationary period, and George Shultz, who was Secretary of Treasury, ran this Economic Policy Board, and he decided that we ought to get the Congress to suspend all new starts in infrastructure for at least 3 years. We had about a 50-year backlog. And, you know, they fund these things. It goes on the books. The first year is $5, and then the next year it's $500,000 for Princeton, and it kind of builds and builds and builds. And every politician gets his favorite bridge to nowhere in place. So they decided that OMB, and me specifically, was to go convince the Congress to slow up and suspend new starts for 3 years. So I went to see Congressman Jones. Jones was the House Subcommittee of Public Works, and he was 80-something years old. Came from Alabama, a deep Southern drawl, and OMB was a great organization. They prepared me then with flip charts. We didn't have the fancy stuff that people have today with slides and stuff. So I went through this presentation, and I pointed out to him why it made all the sense in the world for this country just to stop new starts for some period of time. He interrupted me once. It's about 10 o'clock in the morning. He takes his jug of booze out of it was brandy, I think. He poured some for me and some for him. I could still smell that stuff. He took one down, a really perfect gentleman. And at the end of my presentation, there was kind of a moment where I thought he was thinking about it. And he said to me in his deep Southern voice, he said, "Boy, you fussing with the testicles of the universe." And of course, you know, they use this. It's a big trading game. He gave you your bridge, so that when his issue came up in the Appropriations Committee, he got paid back. And I was a little naive and didn't understand. I got a fast lesson that morning. New starts were up that year.
As we're drawing to a close here, I'm tempted to stop on that point, but
He's just warming
I've got one more story to tell before we leave.
some issues that perhaps you don't have an opinion on because it's more recent, but it's on everyone's mind. Fracking for natural gas. Maybe if you can comment on the technology and environmental policy, but but probably an area that you can comment on. Just what is it going to do to prices, and when we talk about the economics of oil, and I know natural gas and oil are connected, so is fracking the right way to go, and then what's it going to do to pricing?
There's a body of knowledge that says that fracking is safe. There are opponents who are raising questions about fracking. We need a very good faith look and a very good faith debate. Nothing is ever going to be completely 100% without question absolutely safe. I don't care what it is. If we need to test it, we need to prove it one way, or we need to prove it the other way without it becoming a political ingredient. And that's what's happening now. It's the one side that wants to please the environmentalists they don't even want to look, they don't even want to talk about it. And the other side who just want to develop energy think these other guys are un-American. We've got to stop that. We need a president and we need a Congress that will lead us to a little different place on these issues so that we can honestly look at them and decide whether we're going to go forward with them or not. And in this case, my judgment is that there will be some motion in that direction. I have one more story.
Okay, I have 2 or 3 more questions. I'm watching the clock.
Okay.
And these are questions that I think are they surprised me when I first read them, but they're good questions. Should we export our surplus coal and our surplus natural gas? And then a second question, how can we encourage offshore drilling?
Coal, yes, because it's going to be, in the foreseeable future, we're not going to burn our own coal because of scrubbing technology. Natural gas, no. We need to invest in the infrastructure that will deliver it to the burner tip, whether it's in an automobile or in a factory. And what was the third part of that question?
Well, you answered the first 2. Then, how can we encourage offshore drilling? And I buried a question here about is it safe?
Offshore drilling at these prices are economic, so that's not an issue. There are environmental issues that need to be addressed. Is it safe? We had this big BP thing, and it demonstrates that nothing is absolutely safe. Now, this wasn't the technology. I know as much about it as you do, but it looked to me like there was some human error there. And so you've got to, like when you fly airplanes and you make airplanes, you've got to make it 1,000 times safer, which I think you can do. So I think, yes, we should drill more. I think we should drill more in some of the protected areas that we haven't up till now. And I think we should do more offshore. And I think we ought to have, safety and environmental standards that are pretty damn rigid.
I know last time we were together, we talked a little bit about alternative energy efforts that the Ford administration initiated that have now led to NREL and some of the alternative energy practices that are coming to the fore, solar and wind and all. Back when you were in the administration, what was the view on the most likely alternative energy that was going to hit in the near term? And let me make one more comment. The solar energy people, every year they say solar energy is going to be cost competitive in 3 or 4 years. And that was starting back in the mid-'70s, and we're still waiting. So how did it look back in the 70s?
About the way it looks today.
3 more years.
Armand Hammer, who ran Occidental, used to come to Washington. I don't know if you guys remember Armand Hammer. He was really a figure in that industry. And
I always thought he made baking soda.
And he wanted more federal land for oil shale. And he'd come and he'd call, and I wouldn't return his call. The next call I'd get was from the president. Hammer's in town. What does he want? So I wound up seeing him, and and he was the same way. In 2 years we'll compete economically. Well, it's still not competing economically, and look where the price of oil is. Look, it's come a long way. But had we started earlier, had in 1976 the Congress passed the president's program, we would have started the process of the private sector mapping out the future economic return and making the investments in these alternate fuels that we're trying to speed up now, and it's just going to take years. We now get, I would say, 3% of our energy from alternate sources. I don't know what the new number is, but
It's probably
3-4%.
about that, right. If you count hydro.
So it's neat to talk about, and it's fun. I'm on a board of a private equity company that does nothing else but invest in companies that are developing electric storage, solar energy, electric car. It's really a lot of fun, but it ain't going to do the job in our lifetime.
A related global question, and then we'll close with your comment, and that is on global warming, climate change. When we talk about alternative energy, at least the conferences that I go to now, people don't talk about CO2. They don't talk about global warming. They try to talk about the economics. So that issue has been pushed aside, at least where I go and listen to people talk. But was that even an issue back in the 70s? Were people worried about the products of combustion beyond particulate matter or CO2, or SO2?
Yeah, it started. I was when I was at OMB, I led the group of agencies that developed the first Clean Air Act. Well, some of you will be surprised. First Clean Air Act came from Richard Nixon. And then it was amended during the Ford period. Yeah, the beginning of, look, everybody, I don't know who's right on this thing about global warming and emissions. Something's happening. Stuff is going in the air, something's happening. But we don't really, civilized people, look at it and are willing to look at your point of view and your science. Instead, we want to attack you. We want to attack your science. And so we have two groups. One that says, I don't even want to talk about it. And the other group says that the world is coming to an end in 2 days. So we've got to get away from that. And the only way we're going to get away from it is leadership who believes in it and convinces us that it can get done in Washington. Now, my last story, because it's essence Jerry Ford. I was confirmed by the Senate. My first public outing was in Atlanta, Georgia. And we had a town hall. The president liked town halls. We have a group like this from all walks of life. And various cabinet heads would get up and talk about their various plans. And he had me out the first time ever giving my first public presentation on the president's energy plan. I was more than a little nervous. But I got up there and I talked about increasing prices, and I talked about nuclear power, and I talked about all the stuff that's in here. And when I was finished, I said, let's take some questions. The president, who had been out in town, just came back. And as this guy got up, the president came in behind me, and he didn't sit down, he was standing. And this guy said, I got a question, but I want to know whether you smart guys in Washington understand. But if you raise the price of gasoline, I have to spend more time at home. If you raise the price of electric power, I have to keep the lights off. If you raise the price of heating oil, I have to spend more time in bed. And you smart guys understanding that this is a true story, all you guys are doing is raising the size of the U.S. population? I turned around and the president was grinning at me. I want to see how you're going to handle this one, smart guy. So my nervousness doubled. I said to him, look, I'm going to answer your question. With respect to your initial observation, I think I'll pass. And a lady got up in the room and she said, you're going to miss an awful lot of fun. That's a true story. Absolute true story.
Thank you. We're going to let Joe, you can sit down for a minute here.
Well, thank you for a wonderful presentation, Mr. Zarb. The stories, continuing President Ford's legacy, and I think, as I sat here, and I think many of the people in the audience will agree, the straight talk on important issues and things that are happening in Washington, I very much appreciate that opportunity. On behalf of Varn Rittering and Bruce Goodman, thank you so much for your insight on starting this, and for the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy at University of Michigan, Dean Collins for hosting the reception, And again, thank you, Mr. Zarb, for a wonderful presentation. We have a couple gifts of appreciation for you.
Oh, my.